Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of the WonderLab. Today I'm thrilled to have Sofia Carroza, a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard Medical School's Human Network Initiative. Sofia's work explores how the early life environment shapes the human brain, and her academic journey bridges neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. Today we'll uncover her insights into the mystery of the human brain, the role of relationships in shaping who we are, and what neuroscience reveals about our connection to each other and to God. It's fascinating conversation, so don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and share this episode with anyone who's curious about the relationship between science and faith. Could you start just by telling us a little bit about your background, some of the work you're doing now, and just what got you interested in this whole field of neuroscience?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a long journey. I started becoming interested in the brain when I was an adolescent. It was a revolutionary discovery for me when I figured out that the brain had something to do with what people did and what they thought and how they behaved. I was always a curious child. And so this discovery really opened up a whole new vista, a new entry point into understanding myself and the people around me. So I was hooked from a young age, but didn't have the opportunity to formally study neuroscience until I was an undergraduate. I went to the University of Notre Dame and double majored in neuroscience and theology, because already at that age, after a reversion to the faith, I was not only interested in the faith, but aware that it really answered questions that science could not. And so to have a complete picture of reality, I needed both disciplines. For graduate school, though, I went on to study at the University of Cambridge for my master's and PhD. And I'm a developmental network neuroscientist by training, which is just a fancy way of saying I look at children's brains and how they change over time, and looking specifically at structure. So not just one region or set of regions, but really the whole brain.
Was there ever a time in your academic, intellectual life where you felt that there was a real problem between faith and science? Was there ever a crisis where as you dove into your scientific pursuits, you felt like it was in some ways compromising, revelation? Or I'm just curious in terms of how you balance those two interests.
It's an interesting question, because you posed it as, was there ever a problem when you dove into science? And I think I have faced those crises in my journey of faith, particularly before I reverted to the faith. And it was actually at a time when I wasn't diving into the faith or into science. It was when I was just staying on the surface. And on the surface level, if you accept the dominant narrative about the relationship between faith and religion that exists in Western modernity, there is a problem. But that dominant narrative does justice neither to faith and the real nature of faith, the actual, what it's like to be a believer, to follow a particular religion, nor does it do justice to the science and to the limits of the science, both methodological and normative. And so the further I went into my science, the more I saw, exactly as I mentioned before, that there were certain things that neuroscience itself cannot adjudicate, such as the existence of freedom or the nature of love or any of these things, the reality of the mind. And the further I went into my faith, the more I saw that actually, not only was it compatible with scientific pursuits, actually the Catholic Church lies at the origin of the modern scientific endeavor, and has an account of reality that not only that overcomes this false bifurcation between supernatural on the one hand and natural on the other. It has an account of reality as all proceeding forth from the intelligent and loving will of the Creator. And so to study the brain, to study science, is to study the works of his hands, just as studying the facts of salvation history is studying the work of his hands.
Is there, as you've looked into this in some of your sort of compatriots in the scientific world, is there a change among younger scientists in terms of an openness to the supernatural than, as opposed to what might have been going on, even, sort of the rise of the new atheist movement? Do you notice anything among younger scientists where that whole dichotomy between faith and science seems to be dissolving a bit, or do you still see kind of culturally a real sense that faith is pure superstition and that the real hard intellectual work is done in the sciences?
I wouldn't say that I see the division dissolving. There are still many stereotypes and tropes and misconceptions out there, particularly about what they call quote unquote organized religion, which they've falsely divorced from spirituality, of course. So there are many misconceptions out there, but I would say in comparison to previous generations of neuroscientists, my generation is less dogmatically atheist. To put it
Sure.
maybe more simply, we're weirder. There are definitely more neuroscientists now who have fringe philosophical, metaphysical, spiritual commitments, and it's generally accepted that intelligent people can disagree about these things.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a kind of an openness to, as you say, weird kind of return to a kind of spiritual, a sense that maybe everything can't be reduced to matter, but that doesn't necessarily mean a return to kind of organized religion or Christianity. Mm-hmm. It does seem like there is I don't know if you felt this way, but a return to various forms of spirituality, whether it's a kind of pop version of quantum mechanics where I'm going to use my thoughts and manifest things, or the whole phenomena of The Secret, other sort of strange kind of returns of astrology. I don't know if that's something you see as well, but there's a return to a kind of an enchanted world, but it's a kind of bizarre world. I don't know.
It is bizarre because they're not willing to let go at the same time of their reductionist and mechanistic conception of the brain, for example. So you will have a neuroscientist who is explicitly professing panpsychism, this idea that mind is a ubiquitous feature of the material world and is, even you could have a single atom that has some form of cognition, which in a sense, it's weird, but in a sense, it's also an enchanted worldview that makes room for higher level phenomena that at least emerge out of matter and may not be reducible to it. But at the same time, because we're trained in this very reductionist method of approaching the brain, all of our experiments, they can't make room for this. And so there's this tension between how we practice as scientists and then some of the ideological or philosophical commitments we'd like to have. And so there are yet to emerge very coherent movements within neuroscience that kind of provide alternatives to the reductionist worldview, even as these fringe ideas are more popular.
Can you take us through, I want to know your definition of the brain, but before we do that, is there a way you could even give us a little survey of different models of the brain? There's the brain as machine, there's the brain as network. You mentioned in a recent article that in past cultures that it was more of the heart. I think you said the Egyptians, the seat of the person was the heart. What are different ways in which, even if it was just a kind of quick survey, the brain has been viewed historically? And then I'd love to dive into how you view the brain and what it is.
Yeah, it wasn't actually, this is a surprise to a lot of people. The brain was not considered the seat of thoughts and behaviors of the human person until the 1900s, or at least the 19th century. That's really when consensus formed on this question. And so for ancient peoples, with a few exceptions, they largely considered some other organ, sometimes the liver, often it was the heart, for understandable reasons. I think we feel viscerally certain emotions and things in our chest. But they often considered the brain, a more peripheral organ. As you mentioned, the Egyptians, they didn't even embalm the brain. They just poured it out of the nostrils with total disregard for its importance in human life. So it was a recent phenomenon, but there was already evidence early in the early modern period for the centrality of the brain, and often through studying corpses or folks with mental illness or brain injuries. There started to be accumulating signs that to affect the brain was, in a sense, also to affect the mind. And this difficult, which we haven't even solved, quote unquote, yet, this mind-body problem of how is it that these two are so intimately related and yet to seem to be somehow also distinct. You cannot equate mind and brain. So, I mean, of course, there's some people who do. There are a number of different models now that are common, of different traditions or strains of trying to deal with this problem. One is to treat the mind as simply an epiphenomenon. It's not actually a reality. It just seems to exist. It's somewhat of an illusion or nice emergent property that seems to just kind of float over the brain. And it's not actually there, but it just emerges out of the brain. The brain is where everything is really happening. So that's one idea. Another is this dualist conception of, well, yes, the mind does exist, but somehow it influences the brain, and the brain is its tool for getting things done in the world. This is associated with Descartes, maybe not very fairly, but his idea that the mind influences the brain through the pineal gland. So this idea of a ghost in the machine sort of conception of the mind. They're also thoroughly, you mentioned the brain as a machine, so thoroughly materialistic views that don't even acknowledge the mind as anything separate from the brain, but coextensive, and a very mechanized view of the brain, whereby there are just deterministic processes that are interlocking, and to set one in motion or to affect one is to determine the outcome that you see in behavior or in thought. So making no room for human freedom or even really a self. Then, of course, you could go to the other end of the spectrum and be an idealist and say all this matter is merely a function of the ground truth of reality, which is the abstract idea. So, Berkeley, I guess, would be where you draw that from. But David Bentley Hart and others have espoused perhaps more moderate and reasonable forms of idealism in the contemporary discourse and philosophy of mind. But I think, and I'll conclude here, there are all sorts of folk understandings of the brain that don't really fall in any of these buckets. And we often tend to employ different working models of the relationship between brain and mind, depending on what situation we're in. And you hear this in the phrases in the language that people will use. So if you attend to phrases like, can I pick your brain, or this kind of thing, there are different implicit understandings of the nature of memory or of attention or of freedom that are housed within our language. And we tend to move pretty fluidly between one and the other in an unexamined manner. So I don't know that that our culture really has set upon a coherent and consistent answer to the nature of this problem.
Yeah. I think that is so helpful to just kind of survey the ground a bit. In your article, you talk about the brain and your attempt to kind of correct a dominant mentality around what the brain is. Could you share, from your study of it, from your immersion in this science, but also your familiarity with philosophy and theology, what is the brain?
I think of the brain not as the ground truth of the human person, but I think of it as a collection of tissues that happens to be very important for human thought and behavior and emotion, for the mind and the soul. But I think of this in more hylomorphic terms than dualist terms. So I'm not distinguishing them as two causally interacting different levels of the human person, where you have some kind of spiritual substance and a physical substance, but rather that the soul is the form of the body. And so it's the very organization of the brain and its relationship to the rest of the body, the organization and animation of it, the animating principle of it, that I would say is the soul. And so it's not enough to just look at the brain and say that you have a human person. It needs to be organized in a coherent living system. It needs to be animated by a soul. And so the soul ordinarily operates through the properties and functions and activity of the brain. And this is why to affect the brain limits what the soul can do in any given human person. But that's not to say that everything is reducible to the brain. So that's this, mysteriously, intimately related organ that that seems to undergird so much and yet is not quite as central to human identity and flourishing as we would like to believe, because the brain itself, and this was the point of the article that I shared with you, that the brain itself, the more you look at it, the more you see that even on a physical and biological level, it depends upon its contextualization in other realities, like a world, relationships with other people, a body, and the very soul and self that animates it. Without all of these different elements of reality, the brain can't do what it needs to do. So again, just to reiterate, I think it's a very important set of tissues, but one that ultimately is also dependent and more of a tool and a node in a network rather than the sort of source and summit of human life.
So in terms of the the brain and its what about the relationship to the rest of the body? So it's interesting that the Egyptians thought that the seat of thought and behavior was the heart, and even language that we'll use, like, oh, that turned my stomach, when we're really moved by something, there's a sense of all the language we use is relating to the heart, which is an organ. What has been missed maybe in this reductionistic view of consciousness? It's just sort of things happening in the brain. What has been missed in terms of the way in which the entire body is really involved in our engagement with reality? And are there actually when we're experiencing certain things, is there actually physiological things happening in the gut? For instance, when I feel like my stomach is turned over some event, or I'd be curious to know more about the relationship with the body and consciousness.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and the short answer is that you really can do very little with the brain without the rest of the body, especially when you look at development over time. So, there are numerous neurons that aren't even located in your brain. So there are about 200 million in your spinal cord, and there's a population of 100 million in your gut. And so there are all kinds of neurons that don't reside in the brain, and they communicate actively with the brain continuously. This is important for everything from not just maybe the more intuitive things like regulation of your hormones and your heart rate, things like that, but even in regulating your mood and your emotions. So you mentioned like when your stomach turns, for example, there's evidence that the neurons in your gut change the electrical signals that they send to your intestines to alter the rate of these rhythmic contractions in a way that really corresponds not only to that feeling of your stomach turning over, but actually your desire to look away from the disgusting object in front of you. And so this judgment of the emotion of disgust and the judgment of moral disgust are embodied properties that really do require an integrated functioning physiological system. So I think of it more of like a symphony, and you might consider the brain to be the most important section of it. But if you don't also have the woodwinds in the back, it's incomplete, and it can't really perform the symphony how it should. And I think you see this particularly in childhood, because the way that we learn to perform mental acts is often very tightly coupled to performing physical acts. So when you see children learning to do math problems, for example, they will learn to do it by using their fingers or blocks in front of them to have a visual manifestation of the abstract concepts that they're working with. And eventually that gets so solidified they don't need those anymore. But the neural processes that are going on with lots of mental processes, mental acts like turning or rotating an object in your mind, will activate the same neurons that are necessary in order to physically turn it with your hand. And so again, the brain, its activity shows that it presupposes embeddedness within a body and embeddedness in a body over time. So it doesn't make sense to speak of a brain in a vat, for example, to return to some of the science fiction metaphors that you were referencing before. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. I trained as an actor, and one of the things I learned in that whole training was that there were certain acting techniques where you would try to enter into some mental state to get an emotion or to produce an emotion. And for me, it was really challenging. But there were other techniques where you would put your body in you would get your body engaged, and that would actually create the emotion. So there's when your shoulders are slouched, or you put on this posture that could evoke emotion for me much easier than trying to go in and do some sort of mental gymnastics to kind of trick an emotion. And I always wondered to me that really revealed the connection between the body and consciousness or the rest of us, rather than just some kind of mental activity that we're
absolutely biofeedback. It's really important, and actually increasingly useful in applications, for example, in mental health, and to see these problems not just as something, oh, well, we'll tinker with your brain chemistry and it'll go away, but actually by enacting the solutions to your problem, you can from the outside in really change how it is that your mind and your brain are working. So
this seems major implications for the way, like psychology, for mental health. I mean, are there ways in which this kind of older paradigm still kind of dominates the way in which we treat mental illness, for instance, where it's maybe we can just treat sort of chemical reactions in the brain as opposed to taking the full context of the life that's being lived, the body, the whole. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, because it does seem like what you're describing or what you're saying, which is a kind of corrective, has just tremendous implications for mental health in particular.
It does. Yeah. So there was a big push at the National Institutes of Health, and in particular the National Institute of Mental Health, with Dr. Insel, the director, who worked for, 15, 20 years maybe, to try to find a biologically rooted explanation and treatment target for every form of mental illness that exists. And at the end of that, when he concluded his tenure as director of NIMH, he said that it had been a catastrophic failure, and that he had failed patients by not considering other elements of risk and resilience and healing and flourishing. And he's a big advocate now for considering the role of interpersonal relationships in health. I think that's one big part of the picture that is ignored when you take just an individualist perspective on the brain, which of course is, I want to acknowledge, a very important part of the picture, to be clear. But it's not sufficient. And so to hold it together with, well, what are your relationships looking like? Do you have enough money to put enough food on the table for you to be secure? Do you have a connection to a higher power, a sense of meaning or transcendence in your days? Are you spending time in green and nature and getting outside and moving your body? What are you eating? All of these things are also hugely important. And so I would say there has been a shift because everyone expected that approach to work. Maybe not everyone. Lots of people in the field expected that approach to work. And so when it didn't, that caused some serious reckoning. And I think the field has come a long way now to considering other contributors and contextual factors for mental illness. One of them is technology. There's a lot of dialogue now about patterns and habits of using screens and social media and how that may or may not be affecting mental health. I think you see that in that an implicit judgment that it's not just all in the brain. It's not all just determined by genetics. It's also your environment and how you spend your time and what it is that you're nourishing yourself with. So that's one example, I think, of how the field has moved in a more reasonable and holistic direction.
That's really interesting, and I want to talk a little bit more about the technology question and some writing you've done on that. But before jumping into that, the work you're doing right now is is it developmental?
Some of it's developmental. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard Medical School, and some of the work that we're doing is clinical. So looking at aphasia, patients with language disorders. I have a project in palliative care, patients who are dying, but the majority of my work is still developmental in nature.
Is that an issue? Is that an interest of yours? Is that specific, this whole journey that one is on in the relationships with parents and contact? Is this developmental? Would you call it developmental psychology, developmental neuroscience, or what would be the
developmental neuroscience?
Neuroscience.
Yeah.
Is this what was the cause of your interest in that, or why this specific area of focus?
Yeah. I had a beautiful experience when I was 18 or 19 years old of working in an orphanage and a school for children from the slums of Asunción in Paraguay. And I was amazed over the course of my brief time there as a volunteer, as an intern, by the way in which children were adversely affected by growing up without families or without a stable home, but also were almost loved into being again and given a new lease on life by the affectionate and unconditional care of the sisters who were running the orphanage. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And because I'd already started studying neuroscience at that point, I knew that the brain must be involved somehow in this, this radical new beginning that I saw in so many of the children. But surveying the literature, I saw that we didn't really understand what regions were involved, mechanistically, what was happening when a child was adopted or welcomed into a home after being raised without one. And so that sparked my journey, and that formed sort of the main theoretical substance of my dissertation.
Is there something in this that connects to neuroplasticity and the sense in which we're not just determined, we're not necessarily stuck, you've only got this short amount of time in these key years? I mean, I'm a dad now, and I get sometimes paranoid, like, oh my gosh, my son is almost 3, and I know the first 3 years are so important. I hope we didn't screw him up. But there is that sense that because there's I'm just curious, you could say a little bit more about the plasticity of the brain, how that connects to the work you're doing in developmental neuroscience, and then how does that relate to theological or philosophic concepts like virtue and the ability for change, transformation, conversion? Any connections there would be really kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a very important and I think exciting topic. If you'd surveyed developmental neuroscientists, I don't know, 40 years ago, they would have thought that the brain was largely done growing in childhood. And after that, there was no hope. But we've come a long way since then. And we found that actually you can have new neurons born really up until the time you die. And connections in the brain are continually remodeled. So this is what neuroplasticity means. Plasticity or capacity for change that the brain in its structure as well as its function manifests throughout the lifespan. And you mentioned the first 3 years. Plasticity is highest in the womb and in the first few years after birth. And so it is very important during that time to be getting the sensory inputs that you need in order to form this baseline architecture of the brain that will form the foundation for a lifetime of functioning. What does that mean? But you need to receive loving care. So the gaze and touch of one's parents, the affectionate care when you're distressed, the play together, the language, all of these things form the major networks in the brain that then serve as the foundation for a lifetime of functioning. But that's not to say that, again, at age 3, they're not set in stone. There's certainly ways that brain networks can be remodeled. And one particular time where we see a lot of plasticity is during puberty. So that's one time when, due to the surge in gonadal hormones that's released when children are going through puberty, there is a real change in both the structure. So we look at measures like the thickness of the cortex, the volume of certain regions below the cortex. These change during adolescence, as well as activity. So how reactive your brain is to certain stimuli. And so that can be a real time of promise for forming good habits or not forming bad habits, or a time of vulnerability where you are susceptible to environmental influences, especially through your peers. So I guess I would say there's always hope, even for children who have been through extraordinary adversity. The story is never over for them. Wounds can be healed, resilience can be developed. There's, manifest post-traumatic growth in the stories of a lot of people who've experienced adversity. So I want to be very clear that the prospect of redemption and healing, even on a biological level, is always before us. But even more so, as you pointed out there towards the end, I think what this shows about the human person is that first, we were created to be interdependent, and we only come to be ourselves through another's care and self-gift, which is, to me, evocative of the Trinity, and that we were created in the image of a God who is relation. But the second thing I would highlight there is that at the same time, it also demands our freedom, because it's every choice that we make that determines which synaptic connections are kept and which are lost. And so this There's this line from C.S. Lewis where he talks about how every choice we make is turning us more and more into either a heavenly creature that will be with God forever or a hellish creature. And I think that's very true if you look at the brain, that each choice you make has downstream consequences in part because it shapes the neural structure that's going to increase your inclination either toward the good or toward the bad in future moments of decision making. So those are the things I think it draws out for us, this fact of neuroplasticity. One, that we really require others to become ourselves and we can participate in each other's flourishing, but then also that our freedom is essential.
Does this relate, do you think, in any way to like original sin? I remember reading Ratzinger, An Introduction to Christianity, and he has this whole way of thinking about original sin as fundamentally we're born into a context of relationships, and you're born into a context of broken relationships. It's going to impact you. I mean, what you're just describing is really interesting. So we're kind of, and you kind of write about this too, like the gaze of the mother. We're sort of brought into the world through the loving gaze of the mother, but there could be children who maybe didn't get that, and to no fault of their own, that's going to impact them in significant ways. Is there something happening? Is there some way of maybe understanding this whole idea of original sin, but in a deeper way through what's happening on, what neuroscience is happening in terms of these relationships or broken relationships? I don't know if there's anything there, but it's just this whole, when you talk about being born into a world, born into a context of relationships, it almost made me think of broken relationships and what the church is actually pointing towards in this whole idea of original sin.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question, because it is one of the places where I see, maybe not that I understand original sin in a new way, but I think it puts flesh and bones on what original sin is and how it's transmitted from one generation to the next for me. Because it's true that you're born into a context of relationships that forms you even before you have reached the age of reason and freedom. And so you have no choice in the matter. You have inherited this brokenness, this inadequacy of this less than the love that you were made for. And so, it's very clear what the church teaches about, starting with our original parents, and then from each generation, this was a wound that was passed on and inherited. So there's no you're born as a blank slate, as some philosophers held in the Enlightenment. No, you're born with a slate that's already been written upon, and you've been equipped to respond to the world in a certain way that's marked by sin. Yeah. So just to give an example, you see, for instance, children who grow up with parents who don't consistently attend to them with sensitivity and affection. So maybe, the baby's crying and the mother ignores the baby sometimes and responds to the baby at other times. The baby doesn't consistently learn that the mother is there and is listening and is receptive. And this may be through no fault of the mother's own. It could be mental illness or addiction or some other thing that's constraining the mother's freedom. But then the baby learns a lie about reality, which is that there are no certainties in life, and that one has to fend for oneself. And what you see is a replication of that pattern of relationship, the insecure attachment that the baby has with the mother, in many of the relationships that child will then go on to have. So perpetuating this brokenness. And I don't think it's a reasoned choice made in freedom. It's just a conditioning from within that happened through inheriting original sin, which again, we're free in front of. And so there's always the possibility of recovery and growth and healing and integration, but not to imply determinism there. But I do see that the whole world is crying out for redemption, and it's enough to just look at our neurobiology to see that we've inherited something less than what we're made for.
Is there a way to look at the reality of grace from the perspective of neuroscience? So I've always struck by the sense of when I love C.S. Lewis's, what you quoted there, because there's a way in which every decision is sort of gradually leading us in a direction. Then there are these moments of just inexplicable, something stops us in our tracks and we are totally on a new direction. Like I think of, family member who had trouble with alcoholism, and then there was one event and boom, and he's now on a different direction, and it's sort of inexplicable, and it wasn't gradual. How do we understand those sort of remarkable life change, like Saint Paul on the road to Damascus moments. What's happening from the neuroscience perspective when on those events?
I love pondering those moments, and I have the privilege of accompanying patients in my current job, and you often see this, not as much as you'd want to see it, but it does happen in the wake of very serious medical events, so just thinking of a patient who had like a quadruple bypass and was in the clinic, and up to that point had been a lifelong smoker and drinker and didn't exercise, and all of the risk factors were there.
Yeah.
And from one appointment to the next, he had changed all of it. And it's remained in the follow-up appointments we've seen. And I would describe that as a real grace, because everything in his neurobiology was constraining his freedom in that regard, and was making him a slave of the decisions he'd made in the past. And so what's happening in the brain to permit something like that? Gosh, I would love to run a study one day that's examining exactly that. I don't think we know. But one thing I think of often is, I guess two things. One is the importance of desire, that unlike other animals, we can have desires about what our desires are, these second order desires that the Frankfurt School talks about. And so you can want to be someone who doesn't want the cigarette, even as you want the cigarette, right? A dog can't do that. And so the reciprocal connections between our reward system, which mediates these processes of reinforcement and reward, and our higher level cognitive areas like the prefrontal cortex are extremely important for the human brain, for telling us who we are. And that there's this way in which our judgments about what is true and good and beautiful and is worth desiring shapes what we desire. And sometimes, mysteriously, this can be a way that grace breaks through and attracts us to the good, almost despite ourselves, like with our backs against the wall. But that's the second point, is it's still a mystery. Where does that freedom come from? And that new discovery of the good. It's almost as though, to use a metaphor, in brain function and activity, we talk about dynamics being sometimes on the edge of chaos. And so that's really where the brain functions. It's in between an ordered system and a chaotic one. And sometimes I think, again, just in metaphorical terms, I'm not saying this is actually how the grace of God works, but in metaphorical terms, sometimes I think that what grace does is sometimes just pushes us over that edge and into chaos, where we're not following the deterministic pattern of what we've chosen for ourselves. But there is this moment when grace intervenes and changes our direction, or even just gives us a space of emptiness that's not full of our prior decisions and attachments. And at least that's what it feels like in my life when I've had those moments of grace, to begin to choose something new that really on paper should have been quite impossible for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things I found really interesting in some of your other work, explicitly looking at the impact of technology and how that's kind of warping our sense of reality. So psychedelics can kind of change our sense of reality, but the use of screens can as well. And you relate this story of a religious sister who talks about entering religious life, and one of the things she says is she's now free of the slavery of this thing. And and then you go on to talk about how it impacts our sense of time, our sense of space. I want to be sensitive to your time, not to go too long, but I think it's important just for kind of the world we're in today and the addictions to screens. I'd love, just from your perspective, what is this stuff really doing to us, especially young people? And is that religious sister right, that there is a kind of slavery to this thing, and how it's fundamentally untethering us maybe from what's really real? Yeah,
it's an interesting, and it's a question that I ponder a lot, frankly, and have ever since I heard that comment, because at the time I thought she was just being sort of regressive and reactive, and I didn't really sympathize with her thought at all. But the more I've paid attention to phenomenologically, so based on my experience, but then also empirically, studies of the brain, how the use of screens changes our perception of time and space, as you said, the more concerned I get that it is, to use your word, which is a great one, untethering us from the normative interactions and experiences and encounters with reality that have long formed us, that actually are responsible through evolution for what our brain is and how it's organized. It's through encounters with one another in the world that our nervous system developed it all. And so it's exquisitely sensitive to receiving those kinds of stimulations, especially early in life, but really throughout all of life, in order to do what it's supposed to do. It expects to have embodied human people next to you. It expects to be in an environment that is somewhat stable and not bombarded with new information and context all the time. So I am concerned about it. And I think there are some developments in the world of technology that are good in responding to this. Even just, you think about how there are now ways to limit your use of multitasking, because we realized how bad that is for your attention. And so designers are building it into the system to help you do this less. At the same time, that worries me, because it's so clear to me that they're so confident we're going to keep using their devices that they can even build into their own technologies a self-limiting feature which no technology or product ever could have done before without immediately becoming obsolete.
That's a great point. Well, don't you say that multitasking is actually not a thing, right? It's sort of we're not. It's just
a misnomer.
Can you say more about that? I mean, it seems like it's a kind of it just diffuses our ability to be attentive. But what is so say more about how this is a misnomer. I thought that was
the brain really attends to one thing at a time, except in split brain patients, but I'm not going to get into that right now.
Sure.
We pay attention to one thing at a time, really. And so if you're trying to do something if you're trying to do two things that engage a similar cognitive or neural domain, you're really just flipping very quickly back and forth between them. So if I were texting a friend while also engaging in this interview with you, I would not be doing two things at once. I would be splitting my attention very quickly, and I would be processing your words less well and responding to this friend of mine less well. If I was trying to text this person while I was walking, that involves very different neural systems and cognitive systems, and I would probably be fine. You can attend to those things at once. But if it's in the same neural system, and this is what these technologies are increasingly making it very easy for us to do, right? You can answer emails while listening to a lecture. You can, you can read an article while also listening to music. And what this trains the brain to do is try to attend to multiple streams of information at once, fail, and just try harder. And so then when you sit down instead to pray or to have a dinner table conversation with your family or whatever it is, it's so much harder because your brain, it's just trying to do its job, which is to help you navigate the environment. And it's like, I've learned this environment is like lots of things happening at once, and I have to keep flipping between them. And so that's what it's going to try to make you do, when instead you would like to be contemplating the Lord's presence in the Blessed Sacrament, and you just can't do it because your mind keeps wandering. So it's a misnomer that I think is reflective of one of the primary dangers that we're made for attention, for contemplation. That's the highest human good that's attainable to us, and this reordering of those energies toward productivity by making us think of multitasking as a way of getting more done in the same amount of time is really cutting off our highest human end. And I think it's very dangerous anthropologically.
It's funny, like Simone Weil had the quote that something like absolutely unmixed attention is the essence of prayer, something to that effect.
Yes.
And it's interesting if that's what prayer is. It's just the capacity for pure attention, like the loving gaze, where you're just fully present to the other. If this stuff is leading us away from that, that's a problem. And I think we feel it. I mean, I feel it.
Yes.
I think everyone collectively knows that something is off, and yet we don't know what to do because our entire environment now is really oriented around screens and smartphones. Like I'm not sure what to do about it because it's the work I do. I mean, it's like, even if you go back to the automobile, if you were to say, well, I'm not going to drive a car, well, the whole society is organized around the car, so you're going to have to take a bus or something. So that's where I'm at a little bit of a loss, because you see it, and the more research that comes out, you're like, wow, this stuff is like bad. This is very toxic, but what do you do? What do
I
you
have
do?
two things that make me hopeful. I'm honestly very pessimistic and somewhat cynic by nature, but
Sure.
I'm very hopeful actually in this regard, which is not the same thing as optimism, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think one is to go back to Simone Weil. She also says that attention is led by desire. And as you said, there's a general consensus that something's wrong,
Yeah.
that this is not
Yeah.
enough. This is not actually what I'm made for, to be a cog in a wheel that is just most efficiently getting the most material tasks done by using these technologies. That doesn't satisfy me. And I don't think it satisfies your average person on the street, regardless of their metaphysical commitments. To me, that's immensely hopeful, right? Because
Yeah.
attention
Yeah.
is led by desire. And really, the only thing that can teach us to attend once more to one another, to the truth, to the divine, to beauty, is desire for that instead of the sensory stimulation of just scrolling through TikTok or the material productivity of having a clean email inbox. So that's one thing that gives me hope. And the second is that we are not alone. So if it were me against the machine or the tech industry, there would be
Right.
no hope. But there
Yeah.
are cultural, social movements throughout history that have worked to incorporate technology into human life in a way that was humanizing and humane and in line with goods that that civilization had held before the emergence of that technology. And so I trust that we're in an interim period that is extremely uncomfortable, in part because
Yeah.
of the rapid pace of the development and dissemination of these technologies.
Sure.
But I think that collectively we are working on it. We are going to come up with something new.
It seems that is based on a very radically non-determinist view of human agency, which goes back to the kind of that older model sometimes even of the brain, that we're just determined by this piece of hardware. But so too with technology, there can be a sense of there's an inevitability to this, and but we kind of forget that we actually do have the ability to stop and make a decision. I mean, we don't. This is one of the things that I think is so disturbing sometimes about kind of the futurists or the techno optimists. There's a sense there's an inevitability of this stuff, but maybe we've lost that real sense that we human beings are free, and can we remind ourselves that we are not determined, that we are free participants in this, and we can make decisions. I think if we could recover that, then that's what I find most disheartening, is the sense of like, there's a hopelessness when you're just part of a machine, and that maybe is an inheritance from that kind of reductionistic sort of post-enlightenment paradigm, which has been really, I think, toxic to the soul.
I agree. Yeah. I hope that toward this end, I think one simple way to try to affect change is to create more space between stimulus and response. In whatever domain it is that you're working on, before you try to say, can I change my response to something better? And I can't do it, and so I'm going to get frustrated, and I'm going to quit, and I'm going to think that I'm not free. Just try to create more space between stimulus and response. And this works for me when I was trying to quit using profanity after many years of doing so. My first step was not to try to stop using it, but to try to be slower about using it. and that created the space to choose a different word. And I think analogously, you could say with technology, with our use of media, to create more space between stimulus and response, whether that's not taking up a novel technology as soon as it's disseminated, or that's, silencing your notifications so you don't respond to them right away. Whatever it is, there's a space between, and, Viktor Frankl speaks eloquently about how that space is essential for our freedom. And I think he's right.
Yeah. That's really, really helpful. And I think, in a way, that's a good place to conclude, just in that we are, in that space is where we can make a free choice. In that space is where we can actually attend to reality, tend to the other, encounter the other, receive a gift. It's I love that idea of just creating more space, because that's in this dissolving of space and time, which these mediums oftentimes sort of have created, we lost that space. We've lost that interval where we can actually be human, and that's I think that's important in everyone. It's a really nice way to sum things up. There's something deeply needed today about creating space in all aspects of life. So I really appreciate that. Yeah. Thanks so much for your time. It's been wonderful. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on all of the great work you're doing. And I'd love to continue and have more conversations in the future.
Thank you. It's been a joy to be with you.